comparison, but anyone who's listened to the podcast will know that I do this often. I'm going to talk about being in a band. So like, this sounds like to me, it's like when you're preparing for your first, let's say, international tour. Where are we going to get our merch printed? Do we need work visas places? When do we have to have our passports? Who's going to drive us? Where are they going to drive us? What do we do about our finances? If we're carrying money, do we put it in the bank? Do we do bank transfers? How much do we have to pay our booking agent? Where do we get our, X, Y, and Z? All of these things where you're like, hey, I know how to go on tour. Like I know how to play a show, or I know how to like get into a jam room, plug in my guitar and play with my band. I figured out how to go down the street and play a show. I figured out how to go on tour in North America. But if you're planning on going on tour in Europe, it's like a totally different thing. You really need to like understand how to manage that thing. I generally, I'm going to say this very lightly, know how to live. Like, I know how to like, pay my mortgage, pay my taxes, like I know how to go to the bank, where to get my groceries, like, all of the general stuff. Do I know anything about death, which is part of life? 0%, except that I'm like, that will happen at some point. So this makes like incredible sense. Why isn't this an industry?
I think because it's such a taboo subject, and as a change management professional, one of the things that really struck me, and the reason I really wanted to combine change management with end of life planning, is because death is a big change, and the things that we go through with change are well, there's an emotional component to it. But why don't we do this? Why isn't this an industry? I think it's because we as human beings are meaning makers, and we like to know things. And death is like the ultimate unknown. We can't control it. We don't know what's there. And so from a change management perspective, we don't want to go there because it's really uncomfortable, because we can't know what's next.
How do you find clients? Like how have you built up this business?
Well, I started out early days. I set up a death cafe, which is a global movement. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Death Cafe, but for those of your listeners who aren't, it's a global movement. It's in over 80 countries around the world. It was started in London in 2017 by a gentleman named John Underwood and his mother. And it was to provide safe space for people to talk about death and dying, and to because we don't have anywhere in society where we can do that, where it's comfortable. And the whole idea is to provide a safe space to allow people to talk about whatever's on their mind about mortality and about death and dying. So back when I started my business at the beginning of 2018, I started by setting up a death cafe, not to find clients. That's against the philosophy of Death Cafe. But I wanted to know what people were thinking about. I wanted to know what was going on in the heads of people who were thinking about mortality. So I started a death cafe. I started a class called Death Literacy, just on Meetup. And it was a 12-month program. So every month we tackled a different topic related to big life changes, of which the biggest one we talked about was end of life. So we talked about wills, we talked about executorship, we talked about vacation planning and emergency contacts. We talked about emergency funds for big life changes. So I started with the death literacy classes, which I ran for 2 years to sort of gather more information. And from there, I went and reached out to public libraries, municipalities, seniors associations. And eventually the word just got out there that, hey, there's a death expert out there. CBC started calling me every time they had a topic around death and dying. I'd get a call. Hey, you're our death expert. Why don't you come on, CBC and talk about, death and dying from your perspective, whether it was municipal graveyards and cemeteries, or whether it was during COVID, there was a discussion around what do you do when somebody has died, you're in a pandemic, you haven't been able to go over for the funeral, and now you're traveling. And that dichotomy between having joy of being with your family again and also going for a delayed funeral or memorial. And, how do you balance that joy of being able to see your family with the sadness of having to acknowledge that someone has died? So lots of different topics around death and dying, and that just kind of got the word out there, and people started reaching out, and that's kind of all she wrote. And yeah, lots of word of mouth.
I have so many questions. First, I have two ludicrous comments. The first is Death Cafe. As soon as you said that, I imagined every single goth that I went to high school with going to like a coffee shop and being very philosophical. I'm thinking of this one specific person who used to do this like wild dance. All of them are who I think of in a Death Cafe. Second, was it John Underwood, did you say,
Yes.
who came up with this concept?
Well,
Remar-
actually, the concept itself came from a Swiss ethnologist called Bernard Curtaz, who was the first person to sort of have this idea of cafe mortel, like a cafe, a salon where people can talk about death and dying. John Underwood adapted it and used the same sort of concept.
Don't you think that's an eerily similar name to Undertaker?
Underwood, Undertaker.
I mean, come on, come on.
Yeah.
All right, these are my ludicrous comments. Let's go further. What made you interested enough in death to even want to do this? Like when I was like, how'd you start your business? You're like, well, I started a death cafe. Not the answer that most people would give to anything. So where did this interest in the topic of death and the comfort with that discussion start for you?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I do have a degree in anthropology with a specialization in archaeology, which, as I said, is, the study of old dead things. So I've always been really fascinated, and I also really like dinosaurs, fossils, other old dead things. But this whole idea of mortuary practices, when I was practicing archaeology, when I was doing that for a living, the whole concept of mortuary practices and what we did with our mortal remains when we were finished, with our magical meat skeletons, what we did with those things through different cultures around the world, and the universality of how we feared death and were also, putting rites and ceremonies around that passage, that liminal state between the two. So I had this background in anthropology and this fascination with mortuary practices, not in a gothy way, not in a morbid way at all. I always say I'm not morbid. I very rarely wear black. I'm wearing a black t-shirt today, but it's more along the lines of the ritual and the thought and the philosophy behind what happens next and what do we do for this massive event in our lives, and why do we do it?
So you had this interest and you had this like early career. So
Yeah.
how did you end up working in the energy sector with what you were doing in it?
Oh my gosh. Well, I am a bit of a polymath, so my career has been all over the map. And it just so happened that the last iteration of my career before I started my own business happened to be in records and change management, change management, project management, data management, and that kind of thing. And I really, really enjoyed organizational change management because I love change, which, by the way, is also a really uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. So I'm one of those people that just gets excited about the unknown. I don't know why. I just do. I just like the imponderables. That really fascinates me. So change was something I really enjoyed, and teaching was something I really enjoyed, and mortuary practices was something that just always fascinated me. And I went from a leadership role and doing project work to how can I take that sort of institutionalized theory and methodology and marry it with something I really enjoy, something else I really enjoy. And that's kind of where my business idea and philosophy came from, was just to put everything I liked together and said, hey, let's see if we can make a career out of this. Let's see if we can do something with this to make some money.
The reason I ask, outside of, I think it's a really fascinating thing that you've created, is, often people ask me like, well, hey, how did you start Cadence? Like, how did you do this? How did you do that? And a lot of it wasn't like me sitting down and like mapping out this like 7 or 8 year business plan. I was like, well, I'm pretty good at this, and I like doing this, and I have some education and skill set in this. I think I'll just do this. And it wasn't like some big structured like thing that I planned out. I just kind of followed my gut on what was next, and that's how it happened. It sounds like the same thing happened with you.
For sure. And it kind of just found me, like how I ended up not doing people's independent, like meeting with people and consulting with individuals and doing their paperwork. It was just kind of like the flow of all of these natural skills and talents that I love to do, and sort of picking out, as an entrepreneur, we get to choose, picking out the things that I didn't want to do and putting them aside, or outsourcing them, or delegating them, and going, yeah, this is cool. This keeps me wanting to get out of bed in the morning. This keeps me jazzed. This keeps me excited. This keeps me passionate. And as we age, we need things that are going to make us want to get out of bed in the morning, and keep us energized, because we can be very very protective of the energy that we expend as we get older, because we just don't seem to have as much as we used to.